Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjanishalaakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swamin Nitinamine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudirayet. In today's session, we will be discussing from the 32nd verse of the 3rd chapter of the 1st canto Srimad-Bhagavatam. Atah param yad avyaktam avyudha gunabrimhitam adrishta ashruta vastutvat sajivo yat punarbhavaha. The meaning of this verse is, beyond this gross conception of form is another subtle conception of form which is without formal shape and is unseen, unheard and unmanifest. The living being has his form beyond this subtlety. Otherwise, he could not have repeated births. So this verse is talking about punarbhavaha saha jivaha yat punarbhavaha. Saha jivaha yat punarbhavaha. The living entity takes repeated birth because he is not the gross body, he is not even the subtle body. Here, in an earlier verse in this chapter, it was discussed that there is a conception of the Virat Rupa of the Supreme Lord. Because he enters into this universe, and then the universe begins to develop. And the whole universe itself is a form of the Lord. Just like we consider this human form, gross form, external form, as the form of the living being, form of the person inside this body, form of the living being. Similarly, we can consider the external universe, the whole universe as universal form of the Lord, because the Lord is inside, entered into this universe itself. Garbhodakshayi Vishnu, he enters into the universe. But it was explained that the Lord has no material form. Unlike the living being, the Lord does not accept a material body. Now, as regards the living being, what is being now told is that the living being actually has a gross form which is a material bodily conception imposed on the spirit soul. Material bodily conception. Just like I think I am a human being or a man, somebody thinks I am a woman, and a dog thinks I am a dog. So this conception of who I am based on this external gross body, that is called material bodily conception. And beyond this gross conception of form, gross conception means this this form that we see externally. It is made up of earth, water, fire, like that, gross elements. Beyond this is another subtle conception of form. So there is a subtle body, and there is that subtle conception of form also, which is without formal shape. Which is without formal shape. Gross body we can consider in terms of shape. Shape of a human being, shape of a cat, shape of a dog, shape of a cow, shape of a lion, shape of an insect. Gross form, shape. Whereas subtle form we can understand in terms of mentality, mind and mentality. That mentality, it cannot be seen. That subtle body cannot be seen, cannot be heard, unseen, unheard, unmanifest. Unmanifest means there is no particular manifestation which we can identify. This is the mind. No, we cannot. There is no way of identifying the mind in terms of a manifestation. So, without formal shape, because it's unmanifest, there's no question of shape. There's no question of shape. But then there is the mind within, and there is the expression or the symptom of the mind or mentality, we say. Just like a dog behaves like a dog barks like a dog smells like a dog. So that is how we identify dog mentality. Similarly, mentality of a cat, mentality of a cow, mentality of a insect, mentality of a snake. See, definite mentality is there in each of the forms, gross forms. Similarly, human beings also, we talk about mentality. So that mentality or mind without formal shape, unseen, unheard, unmanifest. Now, the important point here is the living being, the spirit soul, the actual person, Jiva, has his form beyond this subtlety. The real form, the original form of the living being. The spiritual form. Yes, there is a spiritual form for every living being. Beyond the gross and subtle body. Beyond both. So don't mistake the subtle body to be the spiritual form. No. Spiritual form is beyond even the subtle body. Now, Srila Prabhupada explains in the purport that all such gross and subtle conception of the body are in relation to the living beings. The Lord has no such gross form. He doesn't have subtle form. He only is spiritual personality, spiritual form, entirely spiritual and eternal. Whereas all these gross and subtle forms are temporarily manifest or temporarily exist as a gross body or a subtle body. The living being, the Jiva, has a spiritual form beyond this gross material or subtle psychic existence. Now, one important point Srila Prabhupada says that the living being itself, when the living being leaves this gross body, then all the functions of the body stop, completely stop. Both the gross body functions, like the hands, legs, eyes, ears, all these functions, seeing, touching, smelling, and working, walking, everything stops. And even the functions of the mind, thinking, feeling, willing, experiencing, that also stops. So when all that stops, we say the living being has gone away from the body. The living chala gaya. Hoitu. Gone. Living being is gone. That means the living being is actually beyond this gross and subtle body, both. Now, one more point is that when the gross body is not acting at the time of sleep, consider the person is sleeping, very fast asleep, very deep sleep, then the gross body is not working. Externally, at least, the gross body is not working. How do we know there is a living being inside? It is because the breathing is there. So when the breathing you can make out, yes, living being is inside this body. The body is just lying down, relaxing or sleeping. But the living being is inside. So when the living being passes away from the body, it does not mean there is no spirit soul. One of the arguments of the atheist is, if there is a spirit soul, then how do we perceive its presence? Spirit soul's presence within the body. The very fact that the body shows living symptoms is because of the presence of the living being or living spirit soul. And when the spirit soul leaves, there are no life symptoms in the body. Any amount of material manipulation cannot make this body function like a living body. That is not possible. That's never possible. So therefore, the living soul is inside this body, and as long as it's inside the body, there are living symptoms, both in the mind and the gross body, mental body and the gross body, or subtle body and the gross body, both. So it is now very clearly established that the living being has repeated birth, because of which there is birth, there is death, again birth and death, again birth and death, repetition of birth and death, punarbhava, punarjanma. Now, very clearly we have to understand the Lord is eternally existent only in His transcendental form. He neither has any gross form nor He has any subtle form. And His body is never be compared to the gross or subtle body of the living being. We can't talk in terms of God's mentality or God's external form. No. He has only spiritual form, which is He Himself. Non-different, completely. He Himself is His form. So, any conception of God's material form or external body is simply imagination. It's imaginary. And that too for the neophytes. It's for the beginners in spiritual life. And the conclusion is, just like the Lord has His spiritual form, eternal transcendental form, every living being has a spiritual form, a transcendental eternal form. But that is conditioned by material contamination. It's like I am spirit soul, That spirit soul means spiritual form. But where is that spiritual form? That is covered by the gross and subtle body at the present moment. Covered. So, and covering is just not simply a covering, it is also a conditioning. What is the meaning of conditioning? That I behave in a certain way, I act in a certain way, I work in a certain way, I speak in a certain way, I see in a particular way. All this is called conditioning. And every person has got his or her own type of conditioning that we know. We identify a person, in fact, by the conditioning. So that is nothing to do with the spiritual form. Nothing to do with the spiritual form. So basically, Srila Sutta Goswami is leading to the understanding that the living being is completely spiritual, has got his spiritual form, has got his existence beyond gross and subtle body, and completely apart from gross and subtle body is the spiritual existence and spiritual form of the living being. And then next verse he will come to seeing oneself and seeing the Lord within. Next verse we will discuss that. But for now, just this understanding that the living being has got his spiritual form beyond his gross and subtle form, and the Lord has no material form, no gross form, no subtle form, nothing. He is eternal, spiritual,